Maya, honestly, look at yourself. You look like a clerk. Chloe didn't whisper. She never did. She was standing in the center of the grand ballroom at the St. Regis, surrounded by Austrian crystal and the scent of 5,000 imported white peonies. She was a vision in her rehearsal dinner gown, a custom silk slip that cost more than most people's cars. She looked at me, her younger sister, and her eyes swept over my charcoal gray blazer and my lack of jewelry with a look of genuine pity. "We have the Stratfords arriving in an hour," Chloe continued, her voice carrying over the bustle of the catering staff. "This merger between our families isn't just a business deal, it's the crowning achievement of the Adams brand. You're a liability to the aesthetic, honey. Try to stay in the shadows, okay? It's where you're best." My father, Richard, didn't look up from his phone, but he nodded in agreement. My mother, Diane, was busy adjusting the silk tie of my brother, Dylan, making sure the golden boy was camera-ready. No one defended me. No one ever did. They saw a plain, quiet 30-year-old daughter who was good with numbers and happy to help. They saw a ghost. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just stood there, feeling the weight of the small leather folder in my hand. They saw the ghost, but they forgot the most important rule of the house. I was the one who held the keys. They saw the plain girl, but they didn't see the woman who had spent the last decade navigating the intricate legal mazes of offshore accounts and high-yield investment portfolios. Chloe didn't know that the very floor she was standing on, the dress she was wearing, and the merger she was so proud of were all sitting on a foundation I had built, and a foundation I was about to remove. Because while they were busy being the face of the brand, I was the one who owned it. I am the sole manager of the $100 million Adams Family Trust, and tonight, the ghost is finally coming into the light. Welcome to Roast and Reckoning, where silence ends and truth begins. Get comfortable, grab your coffee. My name is Maya, and I am 30 years old. The Adams family didn't just live in a house, we lived in a museum dedicated to the Adams brand. If you walked through the mahogany-lined hallways of our estate, you would see the history of a dynasty that appeared perfect. Dylan's polo trophies from the private academy I paid for lined the shelves. Chloe's Influencer of the Year awards and glossy magazine covers were displayed in custom-lit niches. My parents' portraits, Richard and Diane, the king and queen of social capital, hung over the fireplace. Then there was me. There was exactly one photo of me in that entire 3-story mansion. It was a faded 4x6, tucked away in the shadows near the coat closet. I was 21 in the photo, standing at my college graduation. I had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in forensic accounting and a master's in fiduciary law. My parents hadn't been there for the ceremony, they were in St. Tropez for the launch of Chloe's luxury skincare line. The photo was taken by a classmate. It was crooked. It was dusty. It was the perfect metaphor for my life. For 10 years, I was the architecture of their invisibility. My grandfather, a man who had actually built the wealth the family now spent, didn't trust my father's visionary business ideas. He saw Dylan's laziness and Chloe's vanity clearly. In his will, he created a trust so ironclad it could only be managed by someone with the technical skill to protect it, and the moral compass to keep it from being drained. He chose me. But he made me promise to keep it quiet until I was 30. He wanted me to see the family for who they really were before I gave them the keys to the kingdom. So, for a decade, I worked. While Chloe was curating content in Bali and Dylan was networking on private golf courses, I was in a windowless office downtown or hunched over a laptop at 3 a.m. In the family library. I managed the tax mitigation strategies. I balanced the books of the real estate holdings. I ensured the legalities of the $100 million trust were airtight. Every time a credit card was declined in Milan, I was the one who moved the funds. Every time a brand partnership needed a complex legal review, I was the one who stayed up all night doing the work. To my family, I was an unpaid employee. I was the one they called when they needed a signature or a quick favor with their taxes. They didn't see the labor, they only saw the results. They saw the lifestyle, the SUVs, the vacations, and the prestige. They believed the money was theirs by divine right, and that I was simply the clerk who kept the records. I was visible only when they needed a pen. The best thing about numbers is that they don't lie. They don't have egos, and they don't have brands. 2 plus 2 is always 4, nobody can charm it into being 5. My real life happened in the spreadsheets, watching the money flow out like a river. I watched as Dylan took credit for my quarterly financial projections, stripping my name from the headers and presenting them to the board of the family's holding company as his predictive wealth models. I watched as Chloe used trust assets to fund her independent ventures, never realizing that the investors she bragged about were actually just sub-accounts I had set up to keep her from going bankrupt. I used to think that maybe, if I worked a little harder, if I made them a little richer, they might finally look at me and say, "Thank you." But the architecture of invisibility is a trap. The more you do, the more they expect. The more you protect them, the more they believe they are invincible. The Sunday of the wedding rehearsal changed everything. We were at the St. Regis, preparing for the merger of the century. The Stratfords were old money, and the marriage between Chloe and the Stratford heir was intended to be the ultimate brand expansion. The merger required the Adams Family Trust to be restructured into a joint LLC with the Stratfords. It was a deal worth tens of millions in new capital, but it required one thing: the legal consent of the trustee. During the rehearsal dinner, as the elite of the city sipped champagne, my father pulled me into a side parlor. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't comment on the fact that I had spent 36 hours straight finishing the audits for this very deal. He simply handed me a thick, leather-bound binder and a gold pen. "Maya, we need to finalize the restructuring documents before the morning," he said, his voice as cold as the marble floors. "Dylan has already reviewed the strategy. He says it's the only way to scale the brand. Just sign the consent forms and get back to the kitchen. Your mother needs help with the seating cards for the Stratford table." I looked at the binder. I looked at the pen. He didn't even use my name with affection. He used it like a command. "Have you read the restructuring clauses, Dad?" I asked quietly. "Do you know what this does to the principal protection grandfather put in place?" He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that echoed off the walls. "I don't need to read the fine print, Maya. That's what we have you for. Now, put the pen to paper. The adults are talking, and we have a wedding to run." Put the pen down, the adults are talking. That was the phrase he'd used when I was 16, when I tried to tell him he was being overcharged by a contractor. It was the phrase he used when I was 22, when I tried to warn him about a bad investment. It was the theme song of my life. I didn't sign. I tucked the binder under my arm and walked out of the parlor. I went back to my hotel room, but I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop and logged into the Trust's secure server. I navigated to the access history of the strategy folder. Over the last 3 years, Dylan had accessed my private legal strategies and financial models 47 times. Every brilliant idea he had presented to the board, every innovation he had used to impress the Stratfords, was a direct copy-paste from my private work. He hadn't just borrowed my effort, he had harvested my life. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the screen turning the room a cold, clinical blue. I realized then that I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I was watching the bridge they were standing on, and for the first time, I could see exactly how much weight it could take before it snapped. The wedding day arrived with the kind of calculated opulence that only $100 million can buy. There were six-figure floral arrangements, a 10-tier cake encrusted with edible gold, and a fleet of black SUVs to ferry the who's who of the business world. I was instructed by Chloe's wedding planner to arrive through the service entrance. The photography aesthetic is very specific, Chloe told me while she was in the makeup chair. We're going for a royal dynasty vibe. Just stay in the back of the family photos, okay? Stand behind Dylan. You'll be fine. I stood behind Dylan. I watched as my family sold a version of themselves that was built on a foundation of air. I watched my father shake hands with the Stratfords, promising them a historic merger that would secure their legacy for generations. I watched Dylan play the role of the visionary CFO, nodding solemnly as the Stratfords discussed asset allocations. I did the math. 10 years of theft. 10 years of being a ghost. 47 unauthorized entries into my intellectual property. And now, they wanted me to sign away the last of grandfather's protections so they could play act as moguls with someone else's money. The reception was held under a massive glass marquee on the St. Regis Terrace. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet, vibrating energy of old money. My father stood up for the toast. He looked triumphant, a man at the peak of a mountain he had never actually climbed. Tonight, he announced, his voice amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, we don't just celebrate the union of my daughter Chloe and our new son, Julian Stratford. We celebrate the birth of a global empire. The Adams-Stratford merger is a done deal. We have restructured our family trust to anchor this new partnership. It is a historic moment for the Adams brand. The room erupted in applause. The Stratfords beamed. Chloe leaned into her new husband, the very picture of aspirational success. My father looked over at me at the far end of the room, expecting the clerk to nod in submission. Instead, I stood up. I didn't have a champagne glass. I had a folder. And I had a microphone I'd taken from the sound technician's booth. The room went silent. It wasn't the respectful silence of a toast. It was the confused, slightly annoyed silence of a high society crowd watching a glitch in the program. Maya, sit down, my father hissed, his face flushing deep red. This is not your moment. You're right, Dad, I said, my voice steady, calm, and resonant through the speakers. It's not my moment. It's a legal briefing. I walked toward the center of the marquee. The Stratfords looked on with narrowed eyes. Dylan's face went from tan to paper white in 3 seconds. He knew. He knew the moment I opened that folder. My father just mentioned the restructuring of the Adams family trust, I said, looking directly at the Stratford patriarch. What he failed to mention, and what my brother Dylan apparently forgot to check, is that under the terms of my grandfather's will, I am the sole trustee. I have absolute veto power over any asset relocation or restructuring. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My father started toward me, but I didn't stop. As of 4 p.m. today, I have formally, and legally, vetoed the restructuring, I continued. Furthermore, I have spent the last 3 weeks exercising my fiduciary duty to protect the trust from mismanagement. The entirety of the trust's liquid assets, the $100 million that anchors this merger, has been moved into a private LLC that is wholly owned and managed by me. The Adams brand is currently sitting on an empty shell. Chloe's mother-in-law dropped her glass. The sound of crystal shattering on the marble was the only noise in the room. The $100 million you promised the Stratfords isn't there, Dad, I said, turning to him. It's gone. It's sitting in a secure account that requires my thumbprint and mine alone. And for the Stratfords legal team, I've sent a digital package to your firm's senior partners. It includes a side-by-side comparison of the wealth models Dylan presented to you. On the left, my original timestamped filings from 3 years ago. On the right, Dylan's work. It's a masterclass in plagiarism and financial fraud. I looked at Chloe. Her royal dynasty was collapsing in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the country. Her husband was looking at her like she was a stranger. I spent 10 years being the ghost in your machine, I told them. I was the floor you were standing on. I was the heartbeat of the money you spent while you were busy posing for cameras. But ghosts don't sign documents they haven't read. And they don't stay in the shadows forever. I set the microphone down on the white linen table. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to. The fallout was immediate. It was the sound of a story reaching its final, inevitable chapter. The Stratfords stood up and walked out without a single word to my parents. Their lawyers were already on their phones before they reached the valet. Chloe began to scream, a high, thin, desperate sound, as she realized the merger was dead, and her new marriage was likely to follow it into the grave. My father looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't see a clerk. He saw the person who had been holding him up, and he realized I had just stepped out of the room. The entirety of the trust's liquid assets, the $100 million that anchors this merger, has been moved into a private LLC that is wholly owned and managed by me. The Adams brand is currently sitting on an empty shell. Chloe's mother-in-law dropped her glass. The sound of crystal shattering on the marble was the only noise in the room. The $100 million you promised the Stratfords isn't there, Dad, I said, turning to him. It's gone. It's sitting in a secure account that requires my thumbprint and mine alone. And for the Stratfords legal team, I've sent a digital package to your firm's senior partners. It includes a side-by-side comparison of the wealth models Dylan presented to you. On the left, my original timestamped filings from 3 years ago. On the right, Dylan's work. It's a masterclass in plagiarism and financial fraud. I looked at Chloe. Her royal dynasty was collapsing in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the country. Her husband was looking at her like she was a stranger. I spent 10 years being the ghost in your machine, I told them. I was the floor you were standing on. I was the heartbeat of the money you spent while you were busy posing for cameras. But ghosts don't sign documents they haven't read. And they don't stay in the shadows forever. I set the microphone down on the white linen table. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to. The fallout was immediate. It was the sound of a story reaching its final, inevitable chapter. The Stratfords stood up and walked out without a single word to my parents. Their lawyers were already on their phones before they reached the valet. Chloe began to scream, a high, thin, desperate sound, as she realized the merger was dead, and her new marriage was likely to follow it into the grave. My father looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't see a clerk. He saw the person who had been holding him up, and he realized I had just stepped out of the room. The Adams brand didn't just fail, it evaporated. Within a week, the merger was formally dissolved. The Stratfords filed for an annulment before the honeymoon could even begin, citing fraud. My family was left broken silk, living in a mansion they couldn't afford to heat, with cars they couldn't afford to fuel, and a reputation that was radioactive. I didn't stay to watch the slow decay. I went back to my hotel, packed my things, and prepared to leave for my own life. I had accepted a position as a senior partner at a forensic firm in D.C., a place that specialized in fiduciary ethics and corporate transparency. A place that saw me before I even walked through the door. As I walked out of the St. Regis that night, I saw my family one last time. They were huddled in the lobby, arguing with the hotel manager about the bill. They looked small. They looked like people who had spent their whole lives believing the sunset was a performance put on just for them, and they were finally realizing the sun doesn't care who's watching. I had 11 boxes waiting for me in a rental van. 11 boxes that contained the remains of my 10 years of service, my books, my legal certifications, and my grandmother's photos. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even righteous. I just felt spacious. I realized that I didn't hate them, I was just finished. I had spent a decade building a world for them, and now, I was going to build one for myself. People ask me if I regret destroying the family brand. The truth is, I didn't destroy it. I just stopped pretending it was real. I stopped building the floor they were standing on. I drove east into the sunrise, the USB drive in my pocket weighing less than a coin, but the truth on it weighing $100 million. For the first time in my life, the air tasted like my own. I wasn't a liability. I wasn't an aesthetic choice. I was Maya, and I was finally visible to the only person who mattered. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt like the invisible pillar holding up someone else's roof, leave a comment. I read every single one. And come back tomorrow. I'll have the coffee ready and another story waiting. Apologies are just the sound a door makes when it finally unsticks. You belong here.